The Sith will rule the galaxy. And we shall have
lamb chops.
Well, this guy's crazy.
You take one look at the animal and you wonder how anyone could love a face like that.
If we sow tomato seed, we will always get tomato plants.
Give me a drink. Real simple. Give me a drink. Give me a drink.
Let's watch a video. This is a classic. Let's watch.
Thank you, David. Loving the comb-over this year, by the way. Looking sharp. Anyway, hello there, and welcome to the attic. I'm Lloyd Evans, and you're watching the finale in a series of videos in which I'm following the material shown to Jehovah's Witnesses at their 2022 Pursue Peace Convention, which, as with the previous two conventions, is taking place virtually in response to the COVID pandemic. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the concluding Sunday afternoon session of the convention, and as usual, there's a lot to get through. So without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
Vi mladi svi srce mi uvek radujte, istinu srcem svim rado primite, tim satanske laži vi opovrgnite, nek celi svet vidi da mene volite. Sad mudro svi, sinovi dragi, I kćeri moje voljene.
We've been watching the music video presentation that kicks off the Sunday afternoon session of the convention. As I've explained previously in these rebuttals, the music video presentation is intended as a signal to convention goers that they need to stop talking among themselves and find their seats. So it's a bit redundant, quite frankly, in the case of a virtual convention where everything's just in downloadable video form. So no one really has to find their seats. They can just start playing the video. For some reason, the organization sees fit to devote time and resources to producing these presentations anyway, and largely I can ignore them because it's just music and images and, you know, the typical sort of stuff that you would see portraying Jehovah's Witnesses preaching and that sort of thing. But I do occasionally comment on them because in this case what you have is a glaring example of how the religion works and how it proliferates, even though it's nonsense. I think this is quite frankly how most religions proliferate in the modern era. It's by child indoctrination. And that's celebrated in what we've just seen there. They are literally showing a baby with a, maybe Tibor can overlay, with a brochure being shoved in its face. This is a question I get asked quite a lot, you know, when I'm in conversation with people. You know, why did you join Jehovah's Witnesses? What convinced you to be one in the first place? And my answer is always, well, it's all I knew from when I was tiny, from when I could first start talking and having conversations. When this is the entire reality that you grow up on, what else are you supposed to think? You know, it's only when you start developing critical thinking skills that the beliefs start to unravel. But even by that point, they're so firmly embedded in your brain chemistry that it's very, very hard to shake them. And in this grotesque sequence in the music video presentation, again, this child indoctrination element is celebrated. They did a similar thing earlier in the convention. In fact, if Tibor is gracious, maybe you will see a thumbnail to Sushi 348. Jehovah's Witnesses celebrate using kids to recruit new converts. This was also in a music video presentation. They showed, as we kind of saw in what we've just seen in this session, they showed kids preaching. And as I argued there, how are kids in any position to show up on an adult's doorstep and tell them that they need to change their religion? So this is an organization that is shameless in the way it not only uses children as recruitment operatives, as PR representatives, but it also is very proud of the fact that it fills their minds with its dogma from even before they're able to talk.
In part 1 of our feature Bible drama, we saw how Jehovah gave peace to his servants in the past. As we near the conclusion of this system of things, how can we strengthen our confidence that Jehovah will fulfill his promises for the future? We now invite you to watch part 2 of the feature Bible drama, Jehovah Guides Us in the Way of Peace.
Bible prophecy is a fascinating subject. Prophecy is far more than just predictions about the future. Jehovah knows all the facts. He can even control and change factors to ensure the outcome he desires. At Isaiah 55:11, he says, "My word that goes out of my mouth will not return to me without results, and it will have sure success."
Jehovah's prophecies have a perfect record of success. He has led his people in the past. So when he prophesies that he'll lead his people to real, lasting peace in the future, this isn't a prediction. It's a guarantee.
The prophecies given to Daniel clearly show that God's kingdom will without a doubt bring lasting peace for all mankind.
We've been watching approximately the first minute of part 2 of the documentary Jehovah Guides Us in the Way of Peace. They're calling it a documentary, even though, as I've already commented in these rebuttals, it's not really a documentary. It's just a medley of previous years' Bible dramas, all sort of cobbled together with governing body helpers pretending to be interviewed. They're clearly not speaking extemporaneously. There's clearly no one interviewing them. They're literally, as I've said before, just doing this and speaking to a wall or something off camera. Actually, they're speaking to an auto cue, if we're being fair. So they're speaking to an auto cue as though they're speaking to a person, but you can tell by the way they are talking that what they're saying isn't natural, it's not spontaneous, it's all been scripted for them. That being the case, why do they insult our intelligence? Why don't they just speak straight to the camera? It's, if you think about it, just trickery. It's trying to fool the audience into thinking that these men are more knowledgeable than they really are, that their knowledge is indeed sought after, as it would be for talking heads and subject matter experts in real documentaries. There's just one problem. Because they are not experts, because they are not Bible scholars, what they say is largely nonsense. And even in just the opening minute of part 2, they've been spewing stuff that is spurious at best, outright misleading at worst. We heard there Leonard Myers say,
Jehovah knows all the facts. He can even control and change factors to ensure the outcome he desires.
This is one of those points where I wish Jehovah's Witnesses would just stop and think about what's being said. Jehovah apparently can control and change factors to ensure the outcome he desires, meaning that everything that we see today, including all of the injustice, all of the pain and suffering and death, including the deaths of over 20,000 Jehovah's Witnesses due to the coronavirus, including the brutality we're seeing in wars such as the war in Ukraine, all of this is part of the outcome that Jehovah desires. What sort of God is Jehovah if this is the outcome that he desires? He is the puppet master. He's controlling everything. Everything's going according to his plan. What Jehovah's Witnesses would typically say is, oh yes, but once we're in the paradise, everything's just going to be swell and it's all going to make sense, and all of the suffering we're experiencing now won't matter anymore. Well, try telling that to someone whose entire family has been gunned down in Ukraine, or try telling that to someone who's watched their loved one choked to death due to the coronavirus pandemic. Once it's happened, it's happened. You either remember it or you don't. If the former things won't be called to mind, what you're doing is you're altering the person's brain chemistry. You're removing those memories that make them who they are, and you're spitting out a different person. So I don't buy into this idea that you can just say, well, everything's going to be made right somehow. Once it's happened, it's happened. And what Leonard Myers is telling us here is that everything we're seeing in the world today, including all of the suffering, is all part of an outcome that Jehovah has decided upon. But going back to what I was saying about these men clearly not knowing about Bible scholarship and clearly approaching the Bible from an overly simplistic Bible literalist point of view, let's just revisit what Robert Lucioni said.
Jehovah's prophecies have a perfect record of success.
Jehovah's prophecies have a perfect record of success. Not just a good record, not just like an 80-90% record, but a perfect record of success. Any prophecy that you can point to in the Bible has come true. Robert Lucioni is talking utter gibberish at this point, and I'm glad that, again, we're in this cycle where I don't even have to spend time debunking this because I've already done it. We already heard David Splain say something similar in a past JW Broadcasting episode. In fact, I'm not going to waste your time. The sushi is Sushi 67. If Tibor is gracious, a thumbnail will emerge. David Splain claims Bible prophecy is right 100% of the time. Now, if you would be so kind as to watch this sushi, if you don't know what I'm talking about, and if you do buy into this idea that Bible prophecy is always right, I'd really appreciate you just taking the time. It's actually only a 4-minute, 46-second video, so less than 5 minutes. Take less than 5 minutes of your time and watch this video in which I give you multiple examples of Bible prophecies that did not come true. Just one example is that of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel prophesies about Tyre's destruction, and immediately he has to backtrack. I think he predicts that Nebuchadnezzar will destroy Tyre. And Nebuchadnezzar doesn't manage to do that. So immediately in the verse itself, in Ezekiel, you have Jehovah backpedaling and reworking his prophecy so that he kind of gives himself a second stab at it. It's really quite embarrassing when you read it. But that's just one example of many where prophecy doesn't come true. And what Robert Lucioni says here about there being a perfect record of success is revealed to be an utter lie.
Jehovah has not revealed all the details of how everything will work out, but we know that everything he has revealed will come true. This includes details outlining how world events would unfold in the time of the end, before mankind would experience permanent peace.
Remember, Daniel's prophecy indicated that there would be only one dominant world power in place at the time of the end. By World War I, the power represented by the feat of iron and clay had emerged. During that war, Britain and America forged a partnership that continued through the Second World War.
This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States of America. Neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking people.
These two countries continue to be a dual English-speaking world power. The characteristics of iron and clay used to represent this world power are significant.
And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom will be partly strong and partly fragile.
At times, the United States and Britain have displayed iron-like strength through their involvement in armed conflicts. However, iron mixed with clay is considerably weakened. This can be observed as common people undermine the Anglo-American world power's ability to act with iron-like strength.
The book of Revelation tells us what will soon happen. The political rulers of the world will give the United Nations unprecedented power and authority. The Apostle Paul foretold that the nations will declare peace and security, but it won't prove to be true peace. The nations supporting the UN will attack the institutions of false religion. Then a coalition of Earth's governments that the prophet Ezekiel calls Gog of the land of Magog will attack God's people.
Yet we don't need to be fearful. That's when we can put into action all of the lessons we've learned. Those who trust and obey Jehovah's guidance can look to the near future with confidence.
We're watching part 2 of the Jehovah's Witness documentary, Jehovah Guides Us in the Way of Peace. I can agree with something that Robert Lucioni says here.
We don't need to be fearful.
I agree, because what we've just been listening to is verbal flatulence. This doomsday, fear-mongering rhetoric about the last days intended to terrify a mostly Jehovah's Witness audience into thinking the end is nigh, and doing so with the clear purpose of controlling people and demanding the authority to micromanage people's lives. That's what we've just been watching. The Anglo-American world power, really? You're still banging on about that. They just cannot get over this idea because it's what they themselves grew up on. They can't get over this idea that Britain and America are together a world power predicted in the Bible. If you were to ask just an ordinary British person, if you were to stop them on the street and you were to say, do you consider Britain and America to be a world power? They would say no. Most British people, if anything, sort of resent the fact, if you ask me, that Britain tends to leap to the support of America in nearly all foreign policy decisions, including when America goes to war with other countries. Most British people resent that and especially feel burned over what happened in the war with Iraq. And I would suspect if you were to stop your typical American citizen on the street and say, do you consider your country and Britain to constitute a world power? I can imagine most Americans laughing at you and saying, what are you talking about? Of course we're not a world power. What they're doing is they are conflating two nations being allies with two nations being a world power, which is clearly nonsense. You know, going as far back in human history as you care to, nations and empires have been allies with each other. There's nothing new about that. Doesn't make them a dual entity. But this is the sort of facile thinking you need to buy into as a Jehovah's Witness. This is the sort of sweeping statement that you're supposed to just swallow up and go along with. What it amounts to is presupposition. And religious, evangelical, fundamentalist con artists have been using presupposition to fool people for as long as time. If you look up the word presupposition, because maybe some people watching this are new to this, I hate the fact that Jehovah's Witness propaganda explains the meaning of rudimentary words, but maybe presupposition isn't a rudimentary word. The Google definition is a thing tacitly assumed beforehand at the beginning of a line of argument or course of action. So if you replay what we've just watched, and surely you don't need to, you'll have seen Kenneth Flodin just leap into the commentary and presuppose Anglo-America to be the feet of iron and clay. Of course it doesn't say in the Bible, Anglo-America. Of course you're not going to see that expressed in any way in the Bible. But Jehovah's Witnesses presuppose without any evidence at all that the feet mixed with iron and clay are Anglo-America. No proof needed. No logical reasoning required. You just have to suppose this to be fact without any evidence and just allow the likes of Flodin, Lucioni, Numer, Myers, whichever other governing body helper is posing as a subject matter expert, you just have to take their word for it. And I'm sorry, that's just not how things work. This is one of many examples of why this fake documentary will not be taken seriously by people who possess basic critical thinking skills. And I hope you noticed what Leonard Myers said there about the United Nations.
The nations supporting the UN will attack the institutions of false religion.
This is anti-United Nations rhetoric that is, again, just being regurgitated from previous generations of Watchtower Jehovah's Witness leaders. The governing body helpers grew up on this idea that the United Nations is part of Satan's apparatus for controlling the world. It is an abomination that has been set up as kind of a surrogate for God's kingdom. It's designed to fool people into thinking that political leaders can solve the world's problems, can bring about peace and security. So it's been a part of Jehovah's Witness theology for as long as I can remember that the United Nations is evil. And here they describe the United Nations as attacking false religion. And of course, what they mean by false religion is any religion that's not Jehovah's Witnesses. They crave the time when places of worship that aren't kingdom halls and aren't Jehovah's Witness facilities will be destroyed. They really look forward to seeing the competition being wiped out in this way, and they expect the United Nations to be behind it. But there's a huge plot hole here that you could drive a bus through, namely the fact that the United Nations is all about religious freedom. And all you need to do to confirm this, if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, is go on jw.org. Go to the news section. Here's just one example from 2016, February 9th. Look at the title. UN Human Rights Committee urges South Korea to recognize conscientious objection. The UN is weighing in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses, in this case in South Korea. After a detailed review of South Korea's human rights record, the UN Human Rights Committee adopted its concluding observations on November 3rd, 2015. The committee acknowledged positive steps that South Korea has taken on behalf of human rights, but specifically noted its failure to implement the committee's previous decisions on conscientious objection to military service. And if we just scroll down, it says the report of the UN Human Rights Committee urged the government to immediately release all conscientious objectors imprisoned for refusing military service, clear conscientious objectors of a criminal record, provide them with adequate compensation, and ensure that it does not publicly disclose their personal information, and legally recognize conscientious objection to military service and provide conscientious objectors the opportunity to perform alternative civilian service. The United Nations is here lauded on the Jehovah's Witness website for riding to the rescue of Jehovah's Witnesses, and yet from the other side of their mouths, this organization spews this anti-UN rhetoric, claiming that one day the United Nations will be anti-religious freedom and anti-freedom of conscience. It's just lunacy. So it's not just all the nonsense about the Anglo-American world power that we should be subjecting to derision, and which is just clear evidence that these men don't have a clue what they're talking about. It's also this bizarre stuff about the United Nations that, when exposed to just the slightest scrutiny, completely falls apart.
Jehovah is all-powerful. He's going to help us through whatever we may face. We won't have to fight. And we won't need to fear annihilation. Jehovah has things under control.
And this kingdom will not be passed on to any other people. it will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms. And it alone will stand forever.
God's kingdom will fill and renew the entire earth. Jehovah's promises will be completely fulfilled. Lasting peace will finally become a reality for all mankind.
Just imagine what faithful servants have to look forward to under Jesus' heavenly rule.
He will be able to provide what no man ever could. Can you imagine what that will be like?
I can imagine, William Malenfant. I can imagine a grim dystopia where the entire earth has been cleansed of all non-Jehovah's Witnesses, and everyone who survived Armageddon has to spend all of eternity, essentially, praising and worshipping the monster who has slaughtered billions, including men, women, and children. We're watching, by the way, the concluding minutes of the documentary Jehovah Guides Us in the Way of Peace. Again, they're giving us a medley of previous year's dramas and stitching it all together and using governing body helpers as talking heads as though they are experts. But what I'm finding interesting in this concluding sort of rousing finale is they are giving us a very sanitized version of what Armageddon will be. Now, to be fair to them, I try to play devil's advocate wherever I can. They must be aware by now that their convention dramas, indeed their convention propaganda material, has been stumbling Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly Jehovah's Witness parents. We've heard them admit that Jehovah's Witness parents have been writing in and saying, can you please tone it down a little bit with some of what you're depicting in your dramas, including in the Hezekiah drama, the slaughter of, 180,000 Assyrian soldiers. So they will be discussing Armageddon here, mindful of the fact that there is so much potential for them to receive another flood of letters because of how they're portraying Armageddon. That said, what's to stop them producing a video not for the convention, where you need to effectively sign into the video stating your age, so that you're certifying yourself to be of an appropriate age? What's to stop them actually depicting Armageddon in a video? If they can depict the immense image of Daniel, if they can depict a stone smashing into it and a mountain rising, which is what they're doing here, why can't they devote all of that talent, for want of a better word, to showing us what Armageddon would actually look like, with the fireballs raining down from heaven, with basically bloodshed, with the massacre of billions on a global scale? That's what the Jehovah's Witness religion predicts will happen. Instead, what we're seeing here, and again, I grant that this is for an audience including children, we're seeing images that are effectively metaphor. So, Jesus riding through the heavens, or is it Kenny Rogers? It's hard to tell. Jesus riding his heavenly horse and drawing an arrow, which is a throwback to a previous convention, obviously, and the witnesses all huddled in a circle, I think that's mostly intended as metaphor, but they don't make it very clear, do they? I think some Jehovah's Witnesses will be expecting this to literally happen. But it makes no sense if you think about it, that there would be horses riding around in the heavens and people with beards and white robes and bows and arrows. I mean, this is clearly metaphor, isn't it? But the way they depict it, it's as though this is really going to happen. But again, they're not showing... Well, they seem to depict Armageddon as affecting just people in uniforms or just people with assault weapons, which again is ironic if you think about it, because Bethelites will have had to dress as effectively armed police officers or soldiers and carry those assault weapons. So they seem to depict Armageddon in recent video propaganda and illustrations. Maybe Tibor can overlay an example. They seem to depict the destruction as only affecting people who are wielding guns and who are in uniform. But the teaching is that all Jehovah's Witnesses will die. And that's not something you're seeing depicted. And I think that's for a reason. I think they know how unpopular this teaching would be, even among believing members who, for the most part, I think have settled on a version of the religion that isn't true or isn't accurate to what's in the publications, but that nonetheless allows them to still be believers, so long as they don't voice it out loud. I think most Jehovah's Witnesses are under the impression that God's just going to read people's hearts, and it doesn't matter necessarily whether you're a Jehovah's Witness when Armageddon comes. As long as you've got a good heart, you're going to make it through to the new world. Well, that's not what the literature points out. And if you think about it, if you're a Jehovah's Witness nodding along to this, what's the point of doing a warning work? What's the point of trying to warn people of the end if effectively all you need to do to survive Armageddon is be a good person? There's no point warning anyone, is there? So they do seem to be mindful of the fact that the true horror of their teachings will dissuade not just outsiders from joining the religion, it will also dissuade current members from continuing. It will stumble Jehovah's Witnesses if they were just going to be open about what their teachings are. And I think that's the reason why they need to show Armageddon using these metaphors.
For look, I am creating new heavens and a new earth, and the former things will not be called to mind, nor will they come up into the heart.
The righteous will possess the earth, and they will live forever on it.
He will swallow up death forever. And the sovereign Lord Jehovah will wipe away the tears from all faces.
He will wipe out every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more.
Neither will mourning, nor outcry, nor pain be any more. The former things have passed away.
At that time, the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. At that time, the lame will leap like the deer, and the tongue of the speechless will shout for joy. For waters will burst forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert plain.
They will build houses and live in them. And they will plant vineyards and eat their fruitage.
For the days of my people will be like the days of a tree, and the work of their hands my chosen ones will enjoy to the full.
But the meek will possess the earth, and they will find exquisite delight in the abundance of peace.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that that's the end of the documentary Jehovah Guides Us in the Way of Peace. We've been given this rousing finale all about the paradise and how brilliant everything's going to be. We've had scriptures read to us from the Bible, mostly taken from restorationist verses in the Old Testament, which were all meant as metaphor and hyperbole. If the Jewish people were to do everything expected of them, if they were to follow the law, if they were to behave themselves and not be naughty, everything would be brilliant. And there would be streams in the desert places, their land would be fertile and productive, and everything would go well for them. And Jehovah's Witnesses take these verses and apply them to a literal paradise earth. As I've explained in previous videos, the word paradise only appears 3 times in the Bible. And of those 3 times, Jehovah's Witnesses themselves only acknowledge one of those instances as applying to a literal future paradise, namely when the criminal was being impaled next to Jesus, and Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." That's the only time in the whole of the Bible that God decides to refer to paradise in such a way that supposedly applies to a future global paradise. In all of the Bible. I discussed this and other issues in a video I made, if Tibor is gracious. A thumbnail will appear, 12 problems with the Jehovah's Witness paradise teaching, or words to that effect. And even more problems unravel the more you think about the paradise teaching and the more you try to depict it, as I've argued previously. I mean, let's just think about what we've just been seeing. I'm going to set Tibor a challenge here. I'm hoping that he can actually show you the footage that I'm referring to. But what they're showing is frankly impossible in the paradise they describe. Remember, we're talking about a dystopia where the world has been denuded of modern infrastructure. So realistically, we're talking no power stations, no electricity. We're talking no water treatment. You know, humanity gets sent back to the Dark Ages if what Jehovah's Witnesses expect to happen happens. If there is worldwide destruction of Satan's system, then essentially we're living in the times of Braveheart. As I've said before, we're talking ramshackle huts. We're talking carts, horses and carts, and that sort of thing. We're not talking the sort of things we're seeing here. And here's my list of examples. We've seen kayaks. We've seen snorkel masks. We've seen surfboards, yachts. We've seen steel cables, which along with the yachts would suggest metal foundries. We've seen lots of machined wood. We've seen lots of modern textiles. And we've even seen guitars, or at least one guitar. So, you know, who's making all of this stuff? Who gets the gig of working in the metal foundry or building yachts or machining wood? Just the machining wood, if you think about it, would be a tough gig. And nearly all of the illustrations in the literature going back decades show these timber-framed structures where the wood is all neatly machined. If you've ever been in a lumber yard, you know that it's a messy, unpleasant place with sawdust everywhere. It's noisy, it's grimy, it's horrible, quite frankly. And yet some Jehovah's Witness or some Armageddon survivor or some resurrected one, more on that later, has the job of being stationed there and making all the machined wood for everyone else. And you can only imagine how unpleasant that would be, or if you were working in a metal foundry, or if you were working in a textile mill. Who gets that gig? And then what really irritates me is they're showing in these shots, which appear to be stock footage, which, if you think about it, is quite hypocritical, because the stock footage in many cases will be of worldly people, of people who are not Jehovah's Witnesses. So they're showing stock footage of non-Jehovah's Witnesses enjoying a paradise. These people, in some cases who they're showing, can expect to die at Armageddon if they don't become Jehovah's Witnesses. And yet they're being included in this sequence of footage because it's cheaper for the organization to just drag in a bit of stock footage. And don't get me wrong, I use stock footage, but at least when I show stock footage, I'm not simultaneously praying the death of people who appear in that stock footage. And speaking of death, you have the teaching, as I've said before, that all non-Jehovah's Witnesses will die at Armageddon. I'm sorry, it's in the literature. If you're watching this as a Jehovah's Witness and you think I'm exaggerating, a caption will flash up. I'll give Tibor the actual reference where it says very clearly that you need to be baptized in order to survive Armageddon. So that's no exaggeration. And what will then happen after all the bodies have been buried, or all the death and destruction has been terraformed over, then you have gradually, over the course of 1,000 years, tens of billions of people from history, people who died right up to just before Armageddon starts, tens of billions of people being resurrected, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Genghis Khan, Vlad the Impaler, Joseph Stalin, Osama bin Laden, you name it. They're all going to pop up back into existence because they deserve a second chance. This is the teaching. I'm not exaggerating. Tens of billions of people who have ever lived get resurrected, and yet you have, in these scenes of paradise, maybe Tibor can overlay just a couple of examples, wide open spaces. There's going to be loads of space for you to ride your horse in. There's going to be loads of space for you to take your kayak out. I was watching that kayak scene and I was thinking a realistic portrayal would be the same scene with just hundreds of kayaks all competing for space. That would be more realistic. Or walking along the beach, and instead of it just being one couple walking along the beach, just this heaving mass of bodies on the beach, as you might expect in a tourist hotspot. That's what you should expect in paradise, because Earth's population now is heaving at nearly 8 billion, and yet apparently that's not enough. Apparently in the future, Earth's population will be tens of billions. So even by the Jehovah's Witness theology, if you think about it, much of what we've seen here doesn't make sense. And what it amounts to is trickery and manipulation, because they're trying to, like any clever hucksters and charlatans, they're trying to put a positive spin on things. They're trying to portray things as being desirable. So they're basically giving you this could be a tourist promotional video, couldn't it? They're giving you all of these perks if you can make it through Armageddon as an obedient Jehovah's Witness. They're dangling this carrot and saying, hey, just imagine having your own yacht. And hey, just imagine playing the guitar around the campfire. These are all things you could do now. All of this footage has been filmed right now in real locations in Satan's system of things. The trouble is, when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're so busy serving the organization, you're so busy on this hamster wheel of constantly trying to do better and constantly trying to live up to the expectations placed on you by the governing body, that you don't have time to enjoy your life now and go to all of these exotic places.
Is it possible to have some measure of peace? The answer is found again in the Scriptures, and this time, if you turn with me, please, to the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 3 and 4. Notice this beautiful promise. Praise be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of tender mercies, and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our trials, so that we may be able to comfort others in any sort of trial with the comfort that we receive from God. Isn't that a beautiful scripture? What does it highlight? Notice, Jehovah obviously is aware of our suffering. He feels for us. He wants to help us. It mentions he's the Father of tender mercies. But at the same time, we realize that Jehovah won't step in and fix all our problems at this point. Why? Because this is the time that Satan has the opportunity to try and rule the world. And the problems of this world really come from Satan. At the same time, we wouldn't expect Jehovah to step in and start to solve the problems as if he were helping Satan the devil. But there is a time when Satan will be taken away and the problems will be solved. We could think of Jehovah's position similar to that of a father whose son is running in a marathon race. As he sees his son running in the race, he may see the son is starting to tire out. Or perhaps he may see that others in the race are not obeying the rules. Does that mean that the father then jumps in and takes the place of his son and helps him as he runs along? No, the rules don't allow it. But what the father can do is continue to encourage his son. Keep on going. Yes, you can do it. So in a similar way, what did this verse tell us? It said that Jehovah gives us comfort. How does he do that? He gives us peace by means of his word, the Bible, by means of Holy Spirit, and by the loving brotherhood that we have.
Well, this is very interesting. We've just been hearing from governing body member Jeffrey Jackson. He is giving the final talk of the convention. The finish line is finally in sight. Jeffrey Jackson's talk has the theme, Universal Peace is Sure to Come. And we've just heard a governing body member arguing against divine intervention. We heard there Jeffrey Jackson say,
but at the same time we realize that Jehovah won't step in and fix all our problems at this point. We wouldn't expect Jehovah to step in and start to solve the problems as if he were helping Satan the devil.
So Jehovah does not and cannot step in or intervene in all our problems at this point. Isn't that interesting? In the context of an organization that is repeatedly claiming that Jehovah steps in and solves its problems. It's continually referring to Jehovah's hand as being responsible for the most innocuous of achievements. I mean, there are so many examples I could point to. I'm going to give you just two, but I could do a whole video on this. Some of you will remember the story of the trailer. If Tibor is gracious, a thumbnail will appear to Sushi 260. Jehovah intervenes to help relocate a trailer. Yes, this was, I think, in an annual meeting, the 2021 annual meeting to be precise. They were talking about the preparations for the new Jesus drama and how they had logistical issues caused by the pandemic, and they needed a trailer to be shipped from one part of Australia to another. I kind of thought trailers, by definition, were things that you could move easily. Anyway, they needed to ship a trailer, and as if by magic, the exact amount of money that they needed to ship the trailer was donated, and they attributed this to Jehovah. If that's not Jehovah stepping in to fix a problem, what is? And perhaps my favorite example of Jehovah's hand or Jehovah's blessing being credited with helping to solve a problem when it comes to advancing pure worship, when it comes to helping the organization, is this one.
No one was willing to sell any of their sand that we needed until we reached the last village, which was willing to sell the sand. But the problem was there was a dispute between two chiefs that bordered that beach. And one chief said, no, that's my sand. The other one said it was his sand. Well, they couldn't come to an agreement, so they weren't willing to sell the sand to us. So we were at the stage where we were getting ready to need it in a few days so we could move forward with the extension of the Kingdom Hall. At that point, things got worse because there was a typhoon approaching the island. So we just had the construction crew stop work. So the next morning we were able to get in contact with the construction overseer on the island. And he said, I've got really good news. There was no damage. The storm took a turn just before it hit the island and just grazed it. He says, I have some other good news. I just got a call from the village chiefs. Apparently the storm surge had washed up a bunch of sand over their road to their villages, and they had no way of removing it. So they said, we have plenty of sand. Can you come and help us get rid of it? So we ended up having enough sand for the rest of the project. Jehovah's blessing is the most important thing that we can have on our projects, from the start to the finish.
Jehovah's blessing apparently was responsible for the delivery of some sand for a Kingdom Hall renovation. That's what we've been led to believe there. And I've obviously talked about this before on the channel, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself to those of you who've been following for years, but for some this will be new information. The typhoon that's being referred to here is Typhoon Maisak, which hit the islands of Micronesia in 2015. It killed 7 people and 26 people were injured, and the typhoon caused $8.5 million worth of damage. Here is a news report from 2015.
At least 7 people have died and 26 injured in the Philippines during the Easter weekend as former super typhoon Maisak hit the country's north. Officials have refused to attribute the deaths to the storm, despite most of them occurring by the way of drowning. Still, the country avoided what could have been a much bigger disaster, with memories fresh of the 2013 Typhoon Haiyan, which killed over 6,000 people. Maisak was a similarly strong storm when it passed over Micronesia, but dissipated before it made landfall.
So a typhoon that killed 7 people and injured 26 was Jehovah's blessing. That was Jehovah delivering sand for a Kingdom Hall renovation. That's how Jehovah chose to intervene. And yet, according to Jeffrey Jackson, maybe this is new light. Maybe we're going to hear less about Jehovah's hand in the future. Who knows? But according to Jeffrey Jackson, in this final convention talk, it would be against the rules for Jehovah to intervene to help his servants. He cannot fix all our problems because that would be helping Satan, the devil. So, which is it? Are we supposed to believe in Jehovah's hand intervening in such trivial matters as delivering sand for Kingdom Hall building projects, or shipping trailers from one part of the country to another? Or are we supposed to believe this latest wisdom from Jeffrey Jackson, that Jehovah doing so would be against the rules?
Now, you remember, no doubt, from your previous studies of the Bible, how Jesus then went on to list many events that would occur during the last days. He mentioned wars. He mentioned earthquakes. He mentioned famines and all sorts of pestilences. Truly, we have seen those things happen in recent times. In addition to all of that, Matthew 24, verse 14, mentioned the need to preach the good news of the kingdom. But there could be some who perhaps may doubt a little and say, well, there's been wars all through time. There's been earthquakes at other times, not just in the last days, and food shortages. So why can we be so sure that this is the time when we know that Jesus will soon bring about an end to wickedness? Well, let's use an illustration. Most of us are familiar with using a computer. Now, when you sit at your computer, what's the first thing that you need to do after you've turned it on? Usually you have to type in a password, don't you?
And as Jeffrey knows, secret child abuse databases in particular need passwords.
And you have to get it right. You have to put in all those numbers and letters that are required. Otherwise, you won't be able to start working on the computer. Now, these days, people are very concerned about having strong passwords. What do you think if you had a password that had 24 different letters and numbers? That's a very strong password. And it would be very difficult for someone just randomly to try and find out what those numbers were and unlock your computer. Well, how does that relate to the sign that Jesus gave? Notice that if you look back at Matthew 24, verse 3, the question was not the signs of your presence, but the sign. Just like a password, one sign. But then that sign has many different features. In fact, at least 24 different features. So even though there have been wars in the past, this is the time when we see all those features coming together at one time, and in that way, we could say it opens the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Yes, as we look around us, as we listen to the news each day, we can see that there is a definite fulfillment of what Jesus said.
If you say so, Jeffrey. So we've just been hearing from governing body member Jeffrey Jackson in the concluding talk of the 2022 Pursue Peace Convention titled Universal Peace is Sure to Come. And this is one of two terrible analogies that Jeffrey Jackson gives in trying to argue that we are living in the last days. So I'm not going to replay what he's just said. Hopefully you picked up on it. He said it's not just about there being one or two things that are happening that have been happening throughout human history. He says there are 24 things happening, at least 24, implying that there could be more. So how many is it exactly? Let's use 24, shall we? And he uses this analogy of a password. As anyone who uses passwords should know, when it comes to passwords, it's not just about getting the characters right, as though you can just get the right characters, but just put them in any order. So, for example, there happens to be 26 letters in the alphabet, as we all know. Let's pretend that the alphabet has not 26, but 24 characters. So you effectively have the keyboard in front of you, and you have to fill in the password using the letters of the alphabet. You couldn't just put them in any random order and boom, the computer would be unlocked. You would have to put them in a precise sequential order. So Jeffrey Jackson's analogy would work if we were talking about things happening in a precise order. The password analogy completely falls apart if we're talking about things happening in just any old order. It's a terrible analogy, but I wanted to draw your attention to the article he's alluding to when he refers to these 24 features of the sign. It's actually the March 1st, 1993 Watchtower, and it's a box on page 5. If Tibor is gracious, we're going to scroll through these features of the sign. You'll see there, the first one, unprecedented warfare. Neither of the scriptures quoted there, Matthew 24, 6 and 7, and Revelation 6 verse 4, neither talk about unprecedented warfare. That's a word they've added on. Revelation talks about peace being taken away from the earth, But at what point in history has nobody fought their fellow man? Frankly, you could take either verse at any point in history, and living at that point, you could argue that that verse applied back then, because there's always been fighting and there's always been warfare from the earliest origins of humans. Point 2, earthquakes. When have there been no earthquakes? We live on a planet that is geologically active, a planet with a moving crust. That has always been the case, and therefore there have always been earthquakes. Point 3, food shortages. At what point in history has everyone had enough food to eat? Point 4, pestilences. At what point in history has there been no sickness or disease? Interestingly, the Bible writers seem to think that diseases were attributable to God in some way. They were some kind of curse. And if you think I'm making this up, look up Deuteronomy 28, verse 61, or 2 Kings 5, verses 20 to 27, both of which insinuate that diseases are basically a punishment that God visits on those who displease him. But that's besides the point. We've always had pestilences, or we've always had sickness and disease. Point 5, increasing lawlessness. When in human history have people not committed crimes against each other? I mean, arguably, crimes were far more rampant in ancient times when there was little or no law enforcement. Point 6, ruining of the earth. Now, this is an interesting one because when I was a Jehovah's Witness, this was one of the proof texts that you would use to prove that it's the last days. You would look up Revelation 11, verse 18. But what's interesting is when you do a bit of digging on this verse, it's not as black and white as Jehovah's Witnesses present it. There's actually quite a lot of nuance to the wording in the original Greek. In fact, when you read the same verse in other Bible translations, it doesn't say ruining the earth, it says destroying the earth. So if Tibor is gracious, maybe we can do the trick that we use in the Doctored series. I say trick, we're not misleading anyone. We're just showing how proper Bibles render the text. So the New International Version, you can see it says, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. New Living Translation, it is time to destroy all who have caused destruction on the earth. English Standard Version, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. Berean Standard Bible, to destroy those who destroy the earth. Berean Literal Bible, to destroy those who are destroying the earth. King James Bible, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. So the New World Translation is actually unique in using the word ruin instead. And if you think about it, this is quite significant because you can ruin the earth, at least in terms of whether it's inhabitable for humans or not. Jehovah's Witnesses themselves say that the earth will never be destroyed, and they cite verses in the Bible to support this. I think when they're doctoring their text in this instance, they're trying to harmonize various Bible passages while at the same time smoothing the way for this prophetic angle regarding mankind's pollution, climate change, environmentalism. They're making the Bible fit in with that narrative. But when you read other versions of the same text. It's all stuff that, again, could be applied at any point in history. We're talking about destroying people who are sowing destruction in the earth. And indeed, when you look at various Bible commentaries, that's exactly how they render this passage. So Barnes notes on the Bible, "And shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth, that is, all who have in their conquests spread desolation over the earth, and who have persecuted the righteous, and all who have done injustice and wrong to any class of people." Matthew Poole's commentary, "And shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth, the time also is come when thou hast destroyed or wilt destroy that anti-Christian brood, which so long hath plagued the earth and destroyed thy people in it." Gill's exposition of the entire Bible, "And shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth, or corrupt it," meaning Antichrist and his followers, who destroy the bodies, souls, and estates of men, and not only the inhabitants of the earth, but even the earth itself. For through that laziness and idleness which they spread wherever they come, a fruitful country is turned into barrenness. If you think about it, just that final statement there about barrenness itself makes perfect sense in terms of the original text. Even in ancient times, it was possible to start a forest fire. Even in ancient times, it was possible to take a fertile land and make it desolate, make it unfruitful, unprosperous. And what's interesting is when you go to the Kingdom Interlinear and look up the original Greek, I'll read the English, but obviously the way it works is they are giving you the words of the Greek, and it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense when you read it in English, but it does give you more of the essence. So Revelation 11:18 in the Kingdom Interlinear, "And the nations were made wrathful, and came the wrath of you, and the appointed time of the dead ones to be judged, and to give the reward to the slaves of you, to the prophets, and to the holy ones, and to the ones fearing the name of you, the small ones and the great ones, and to corrupt through the ones corrupting the earth." So this is again fairly vague text that could mean any number of things and could be interpreted any number of ways at any point in history. It's by no means as profound and unique to our day as Jehovah's Witnesses make out when you bother to do the digging, when you bother to see what Bible commentaries say and consult the original Greek. So moving on in our list, 7, love cooling off, based on Matthew 24, verse 12. Again, this is a vague prediction that could apply to any point in time. This is what fortune tellers do. This is what people who claim to be clairvoyant in some way do. They make sure everything's vague. They keep things as vague as possible so that when you're listening to them, you're thinking, oh, wow, yeah, I guess that has happened. I guess I have had an argument recently. How did they know that? Everyone has arguments. So if someone says, I sense that you have had an argument recently, more than likely that's going to apply to you. It's a vague prediction, as is what we're reading in this list. Point 8, fearful sights. They're not even trying at this point. When have there not been things that make people afraid? Point 9, inordinate love of money. When was there a time when people didn't greedily try to enrich themselves? Point number 10, disobedience to parents. Was there really a time when children were all obedient? Again, not even trying. Point number 11, loving pleasures more than God. The word hedonism was literally invented by the ancient Greeks. This, again, can be applied to any point in history. Point 12, love of self dominates. So there was once a point in time in human history when there was no selfishness. And interestingly, dominates in that part of the list, that's been added to the cited verse. It doesn't say dominates or dominant in the original text. You'll have to look it up if you don't believe me. But what they're doing is they're exaggerating the list. They're adding words to the list to make it sound more profound or more specific or less vague, which again, if you think about it, is manipulation. If they need to add words to the list, that speaks to deception, doesn't it? Point 13, general lack of natural affection. This is ironic if you think about it, given that the Jehovah's Witness shunning policy strips parents of their natural affection for their children if the children end up being disfellowshipped for any reason. This is an organization that is in the habit of routinely doing this in families. But that aside, again, this is a vague prediction that anyone in any point of history could say applies to their time period. Oh yes, there's very little natural affection going on nowadays in the times of the Incas, or the times of the Egyptians, or the times of the Romans. Same thing with point 14. People not open to any agreement. People were once in total agreement. Point 15, self-control lacking at all levels of society. Self-discipline was once universal among all humans. Also, the verse cited says nothing about all levels of society. That's, again, wording that they have added themselves. It's not wording that's actually in the Bible. All levels of society. So they're manipulating the reader here. Point 16, widespread loss of love of goodness. There was once a time when there were no evil people. And again, widespread is not found in the Bible verse that they've cited. Point 17, many hypocritically claiming to be Christian. Throughout the history of Christianity, there have been Christians who point the finger at other Christians and say they're not Christian enough. Point 18, I like this one. Excessive eating and drinking by some. So apparently gluttony and drunkenness has only been a thing, really, since 1914. And would it be amiss to point out that this part of the sign seems to be being fulfilled by certain members of the governing body? Point 19, ridiculers reject the sign. How convenient that healthy skepticism of doomsday ideology and fear-mongering is included as part of the sign of the last days. Point 20, many false prophets are active. If you're interested in knowing what a false prophet is, there's a very interesting verse in Deuteronomy 18 verses 20 to 22. I'm not going to read it. I've read it many, many times before on the channel. But this is a verse that identifies false prophets. And if you're a Jehovah's Witness, please read that verse and tell me it doesn't apply to the Jehovah's Witness organization. But that aside, we're still dealing with a vague prediction that can apply at any point in history. Point 21, preaching of the good news of God's established kingdom. Christendom has been evangelizing and sending out missionaries for centuries. There's a reason 90% of Latin Americans identify as Christian. It's not something that's unique to Jehovah's Witnesses to go out and proclaim God's kingdom, to go out and proclaim the end is nigh. It's been happening for centuries. This again is a vague prediction. Point 22, persecution of true Christians, persecution of religious groups, including Christians, has been a thing for as long as there has been religion. And show me a Christian sect or denomination that claims to be untrue. Point 23, cry of peace and security to climax the last days. So this hasn't even happened yet, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, but apparently a political figure seeking or declaring peace and security and vocalizing this is enough to trigger part of the sign. Interestingly, jwfacts.com has a brilliant article summarizing this whole issue of the cry of peace and security and pointing out that throughout human history, going all the way back to Babylonian times, there were political figures proclaiming that they had achieved peace in some way. So again, it's hardly even worthy of comment in terms of it being a prophecy or prediction. And finally, you have item 24, people take no note of danger. There was a point in human history when everyone was taking note of danger, and now, in the last days since 1914, people have stopped doing that. So hopefully I've completely put to bed this ludicrous notion that there are 24 signs all being witnessed today that are unique at this particular point in history. It's simply not the case. And just as a mental exercise, if you're watching this as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I thought it would be fun to compile my own list of 24 signs that are equally vague and could equally apply to any point in history. And it reads pretty much the same. Point number 1, men and women will be bored with their lives. Point number 2, there will be thunderstorms in one place after another. Point number 3, flocks of birds will be seen in the skies. Point number 4, the sun will go dark. Point number 5, flatulence will abound. Point number 6, people will try to impress their fellow man with large dwellings. Point number 7, traders will charge too much for their wares. Point number 8, there will be an abundance of waves in the sea. Point number 9, volcanoes will send forth rivers of molten rock and clouds of ash. Point number 10, ice will fall from the heavens. Point number 11, people will try to seduce each other. Point number 12, due to intoxication from wine, people will have headaches. Tony will know all about that. Point number 13, people will hate their fellow man on account of their tribe or skin color. Point number 14, ravenous insects will drink the blood of mankind. Point number 15, men and women will find no delight in their own appearance. Point number 16, dogs will defecate in the streets. 17, partygoers will awaken regretting what they did the night before. 18, in every nation people will complain about their leaders. 19, scabs will form on the skin of men when they fall and scrape themselves. 20, men will rejoice in seeing others fall and scrape themselves. 21, men will accumulate livestock. 22, stupid people will abound and irritate many. 23, people will cheat at games and sports. 24, crooked men will use lies to control and deceive people.
Truly, the end is close. It's just like a jigsaw puzzle, to use another illustration. When you have all the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle and you start to put them all together, eventually when all the pieces are in place, the picture is clear, isn't it? And that's exactly how we should feel about the prophecy that Jesus gave.
Another flawed analogy. You do not complete a jigsaw just by taking a jigsaw box, opening it, and spilling out the pieces and saying, there, look, I've got all the pieces. These are all the pieces. Therefore, I have the picture. You have to assemble the pieces in a very specific order, just as with the password analogy that he used earlier. The letters that you use need to be sequential. They need to be in a specific sequence to unlock the computer. So his analogy is flawed. It's not simply a case of, do we have all these things going on at the same time? Great, this is the last days. The analogy he's referring to refers to a specific pattern or sequential order. Therefore, the analogy is flawed.
Soon, very soon, he is going to step in and take action. But of course, sometimes we may feel, yes, we've known about this for quite some time. And it means that we've had to wait a long time. But that doesn't negate the fact that the evidence of the last days is here. Perhaps we could illustrate it this way. Most of us have gone to an airport to meet someone who's coming maybe from overseas or another part of the country. Now, since 9/11, it's very hard to go to an airport and actually stand on the side of the runway and see the plane land. Usually what happens, once you get to the airport, you're allowed to go into a large room with other people, and all you see are monitors on the wall. Now, what may the monitors say? Well, you see it says there, the flight has left. Then later, maybe the monitor says the flight is on time. Then it says the flight has landed. Then it says the flight is taxiing. Then it says at the gate. Well, now you're starting to get really excited, aren't you? And yet you haven't seen the plane and you haven't seen your friend yet. But you can see from the indications of what you're seeing on the monitor that it must be close. And then all of a sudden the doors open, people start to come out. Well, now you're really excited because you know, yes, you're going to meet your friend. Well, that is similar to how we can view the last days. There's been a lot of things happening that we don't actually see, but we see the indications of what's happened. And we know that very soon, Jesus, the angels, and the 144,000 will take steps to remove this old world and then take further steps toward the restoration of peace. Isn't that a beautiful promise?
The slaughter of billions for not being Jehovah's Witnesses, no, I don't view that as a beautiful promise. I view that as grotesque doomsday ideology. But what we have here, yet again, he just keeps spitting them out. Apparently, he's very proud of these incredibly dodgy and silly analogies. I feel like I'm actually dropping IQ points as he's talking because the analogies have so many holes in them. But let's just take that one about the airport. And Jeffrey, if you're watching, I'm going to fix it for you. So imagine you turn up at an airport to pick up your friend and you go into the arrivals and you look at the monitor and it says flight on time. So you're really pleased. You're going to be seeing your friend soon. And then half an hour passes and the flight says on time. And you're thinking, okay, he should have been here by now, or she. Why aren't they here? Is there a problem? Anyway, I'll stick it out. I'll maybe go and get a macchiato. And I'll sit at the coffee shop with the monitor in view so that I can be ready to spring up when my friend arrives. 2 hours go by. the screen still says on time. And it's starting to get quite inconvenient. You're starting to have to ring back home and explain that there's a problem and your friend is really, really late, but you insist on being there to meet them. A day goes by. Now you're missing work. Now you're in trouble with your boss. Your family back home are confused as to why you're still at the airport instead of coming home and maybe monitoring on the internet whether the flight has landed or not. But you insist on staying at the airport. Weeks go by. You're living at the airport now. It's a bit like Tom Hanks in The Terminal. You figured out how to survive by taking coins out of abandoned luggage trolleys and just eking out an existence. You found maybe a cleaning cupboard that you can use as a rudimentary shelter, and you've befriended one of the airport cleaners on whom you have a bit of a crush, who is helping you eke out an existence. Months go by. By this point, you and the cleaner are living together in the cleaning cupboard, and periodically you'll emerge from the cleaning cupboard looking very dishevelled, with a full-on beard, and you'll check to see that the monitor still says flight on time. 2 years go by. By this point, you're like Tom Hanks in Castaway. Your clothes are hanging off you in shreds because you haven't been able to change them in so long. You're basically surviving off scraps that you've foraged from bins and from plates that have been discarded in the canteen. Obviously, by this point, your family has disowned you and reported you missing, but for some reason, the authorities can't find you in the airport because you're so well concealed and so well hidden, and maybe you don't want to be found, but you do still keep checking the monitor. 10 years go by. By this point, you and the cleaner have children, and you're raising your children to carry on your vigil of making sure that the friend gets collected, of making sure that they keep checking the monitor to see whether the flight has landed and whether the friend can be picked up. And you encourage your children that if they ever have children, they should continue this vigil of religiously checking the monitor and seeing whether the on time changes to landed. 140 years go by. You have long since died. Your children have long since died. And now your grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still checking the monitor, which still, after 140 years, still says on time. That would be a more accurate analogy. That's how long this group has been proclaiming the end. And if you don't believe me, maybe you're a Jehovah's Witness watching who thinks, well, that's a bit unfair. We weren't saying that at the beginning. Here's the front page of the very first watchtower, Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence, published July 1879. Let's read the first few words. Prospectus. This is the first number of the first volume of Zion's Watchtower, and it may not be amiss to state the object of its publication. That we are living in the last days, the day of the Lord, the end of the gospel age, and consequently in the dawn of the new age, are facts not only discernible by the close student of the word led by the Spirit, but the outward signs recognizable by the world bear the same testimony, and we are desirous that the household of faith be fully awake to the fact that we are living, we are dwelling in a grand and awful time, in an age on ages telling, to be living is sublime. Those were literally the first words of the first watchtower printed in 1879. Nobody, Jeffrey Jackson, waits for a plane to land for 140 years. That's how long it would take for your analogy to be remotely applicable.
So what's another step that Jesus will take in removing those who disrupt the peace? Well, let's look at another chapter in the same book, Revelation chapter 19. Revelation chapter 19, and we're going to read starting at verse 19 right through to 21. We might mention before we start reading it that here it describes political organizations, kings, and those who oppose Jesus and Jehovah God. And in a symbolic way, it refers to these as beasts, as organizations that have disrupted the peace. Let's see what happens to them. And I saw the wild beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to wage war against the one seated on the horse and against his army. Now that one is Jesus Christ. And the wild beast was caught, and along with it the false prophet that performed in front of it the signs with which he misled those who received the mark of the wild beast and those who worship its image. While still alive, they both were hurled into the fiery lake that burns with sulfur. So what happens to these political organizations in opposition to Jehovah and Jesus? Again, we see the word hurled down into destruction. And what about the rest of mankind that opposes Jesus' rule? Well, let's look at verse 21. What does it say? But the rest were killed off with the long sword that proceeded out of the mouth of the one seated on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. Now that's a very interesting comment, isn't it? It helps us to see here that all those who oppose Jesus will be destroyed in the Battle of Armageddon.
How charming. I'm sure all the kids in the audience will have really enjoyed that mental image of birds feasting on the flesh of God's enemies. We've been watching some of the concluding words of the final talk of the 2022 Pursue Peace Convention. This is governing body member Jeffrey Jackson delivering the talk, Universal Peace is Sure to Come. What can I say? Again, he's doing my work for me. He's showing that this is an organization that uses fear to control people. Because if you're in the audience watching this talk, you're thinking, well, I don't want to be among the people that get feasted on by birds. I want to be on the team that makes it through Armageddon. And what's most disgusting for me, apart from, again, this grotesque mental image being thrust at families with children, because Jeffrey Jackson is entitled to whatever deluded fantasies he wishes to entertain in his tiny brain. But indoctrinating children with this fear-mongering doomsday twaddle is something else entirely. What I find incredibly disingenuous about this talk is that he doesn't make clear who he means by those who oppose Jesus' rule.
And what about the rest of mankind that opposes Jesus' rule? It helps us to see here that all those who oppose Jesus will be destroyed in the Battle of Armageddon.
All those who oppose Jesus will be destroyed in the Battle of Armageddon. Don't you mean all those who aren't Jehovah's Witnesses, Jeffrey Jackson? I think that's what you really mean. But to make this talk more palatable, you're trying to insinuate that simply not opposing Jesus is enough to get you through Armageddon, which implies that when you see Armageddon unfolding and you see Jesus looking suspiciously like Kenny Rogers riding in the heavens, perhaps even then you might feel inclined to welcome him and not oppose him, and maybe you'll make it through. This is the sort of loophole that you'll be searching for if you're in the audience, thinking, well, I would never oppose Jesus riding in on the heavens with his bow and arrow. I wouldn't want to oppose him. He can do what he wants, and then I'll make it through Armageddon. It's not that simple. And to drive this point home, I've alluded to this text earlier in the rebuttal, but maybe we should actually read it just to make it crystal clear, because I know there will be Jehovah's Witnesses commenting on this video saying, oh, how dare you say that we teach that all non-Jehovah's Witnesses will be killed. I refer you to the Watchtower of 2019, October. This is from pages 11 and 12. We need to help people understand how important it is for them to take their stand for Jehovah and his kingdom. This means trying to motivate people to make the truth their own by applying what they learn, dedicating their life to Jehovah, and getting baptized. Only then will they survive Jehovah's Day. It's right there in the publications. They don't say it all that often. They don't say it that clearly all that often, which allows many Jehovah's Witnesses to create this alternative version of the religion in their minds, which is more palatable, which says, oh, it's just about your heart condition. Again, that doesn't make sense if this is a warning work. The literature, every now and then, states it plainly that you have to be a Jehovah's Witness to make it through Armageddon. And yet, disingenuously, because he is a charlatan and a shady huckster who's out to deceive people, Jeffrey Jackson, rather than simply saying all non-Jehovah's Witnesses will be killed, he says all those who oppose Jesus' rule will be killed.
So at this point, when we're thinking about all these beautiful things that will occur, let's enjoy the final video of our convention. It highlights the blessings of the 1,000-year reign and beyond. And also, we're going to listen to the original song that we'll sing at the conclusion of our program.
Like an island of calm in dark, stormy seas, God's people are living in peace. With our eyes of faith, we see beyond the clouds and know that the storm soon will cease. To the ends of the earth, there'll be peace at last for all eternity. From the valleys below to the mountain tops, all creation will see peace at last. When the new world is here, all will be one on earth and in heaven above, and the peace we'll know we've never known before, a world ruled by justice and love. To the earth there'll be peace at last for all eternity. From the valleys below to the mountain tops, all creation will sing. To the ends of the earth there'll be peace at last for all eternity. From the valleys below to the mountain tops, all creation will see peace at last. Peace at
What a beautiful song, and what beautiful images to encourage us.
So there we have it. That's it. That's the grand finale to the 2022 Pursue Peace Convention. And it seems that due to an administrative glitch, yours truly has somehow found his way into paradise. He's found himself, or I found myself, in all sorts of unpleasant situations. But when Armageddon strikes, somehow I'm able to join Jehovah's Witness Armageddon survivors in fleeing Armageddon into paradise. Maybe if Tibor is gracious, we can take another look at that footage of Jehovah's Witnesses walking through a field as Armageddon rages in the background. Just to be absolutely clear, Tibor and I added the footage you saw previously of fireballs and the guy trapped under the rubble just to drive home what's really supposed to be happening. But as for the line of people fleeing Armageddon, this is actually a familiar image to generations of Jehovah's Witnesses, because all you need to do is Google Jehovah Armageddon and you'll get no end of disturbing imagery showing Armageddon, but quite a few images show this specific scene of a line of Jehovah's Witnesses walking away from Armageddon, which, if you think about it, doesn't really make any sense. It implies that while Armageddon is unfolding, there will be fields to flee to. Surely the whole point of a global slaughter of non-Jehovah's Witnesses is that you could literally be stood next to a non-Jehovah's Witness as a Jehovah's Witness, and they'll die, but you won't. So, yes, there may be all the lightning, yes, there may be all the earthquakes and buildings collapsing and all of the typical Armageddon imagery, grim, morbid, terrifying Armageddon imagery that Jehovah's Witnesses have been subjected to over the decades. But technically, it shouldn't matter where you are on the planet. If you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, you should be able to stand still and see Jehovah's salvation. It shouldn't matter where you are. You should, again, be able to be in the same room as someone who gets slaughtered. Maybe it's a precision fireball that cuts through the ceiling at precisely their location, leaving you completely unharmed. I don't understand why you would have a line of Jehovah's Witnesses walking away from Armageddon, and why does Armageddon need to last so long? Why does it take so long for an all-powerful God, for Jesus or Kenny Rogers, whoever it is, riding around on heavenly horses with the 144,000? Why does it take them so long to do the carnage? Didn't we have that imagery in the Hezekiah drama of the angel taking out 180,000 plus Assyrians just like that? So why does it take so long, and how are there fields to flee to? So anyway, there's no use trying to make sense of nonsense, is there? It should just be plainly obvious to at least those with critical thinking that none of this makes any sense. There were just a couple of other scenes I wanted to draw your attention to, because there's quite a lot here to unpick. Again, the more you subject this to scrutiny, the more it unravels. So you see the scene where they are tidying up after Armageddon. They've got their gloves on, they've got their shovels, and they're removing bricks and bits of debris, which probably have bits of humans on them. Blood-stained bricks that have been left over once the birds are done feasting on the remains of those slaughtered. And in one scene, maybe Tibor will need to enlarge it slightly, but just to the left, you have the birds flying over. Presumably, they're just finishing off their last Armageddon victim, or on their way to finish off their last Armageddon victim. But you see just in the bottom left some wolves and I think a sheep or a lamb. And I think that's supposed to be a nudge to Stephen Lett's absurd lamb chops remarks right at the beginning of the convention, where he reminded Jehovah's Witnesses that there will be no more carnivores, that the wolf and the lamb will literally be able to reside together in peace. No more sharks feasting on seals, no more lions chasing down gazelle. Snakes will find an alternative use for their venom. It's all going to happen in the future. And another scene I want to show you is the image where the two sisters are hugging, and there's a palm tree in the background, and there's what looks like a beautiful villa and various yachts in the background. You have the obligatory fruit table, which it looks like a monkey is helping himself to. But it's all looking very neat and orderly, isn't it? And frankly, it's a million miles away from what Jehovah's Witnesses should really expect, which is, again, a revisiting of the Dark Ages with no modern infrastructure, no electricity, no water treatment or sewage. Everyone's basically just in Bear Grylls survival mode. Because, where is all of this prosperity supposed to come from? Where are people getting their yachts from? Where do people have time to build yachts if they're just having to survive day to day with no creature comforts and none of the things that we've come to take for granted in the modern age? Another thing I want to show you is the scene where you have the young woman lying down in the forest underneath a leopard. I think I know who might be responsible when it comes to influencing the makers of this video to include this particular scene.
Our hard-working art department has helped us a lot. Notice this beautiful piece of artwork found in the Pure Worship book. Now you have to, with the larger one on a television screen, you see it easier. Sometimes you look at this picture, you have the fireflies there going around, full moon, it's beautiful. But with the larger picture, you're not going to miss what so many could miss by not focusing on the beautiful picture here and the details in it. Because up above her now, you'll see her sleeping securely, young sister here, and the tree's right above her head, but do you see what's right up above there? If you look carefully, there it is, a leopard. And it could be missed so easily, especially in the book we have, and you got to see his left arms hanging there, male or female, don't know for sure, but it's a leopard. And he's sleeping. She's sleeping. You could just hear some of the sounds of other insects that might be in the forest here, secure.
Tony Morris there talking us through the details of a picture of a girl sleeping in the forest underneath a leopard. This particular picture, it seems, is a picture that Tony Morris is quite fond of. And it wouldn't surprise me if the inclusion of the imagery in the final music video of the 2022 convention was maybe his doing. I can't prove it, but it really wouldn't surprise me if he weighed in there and urged that scene to be included. But one more scene I want to go over with you again. You have this imagery of the heavens, the 144,000, including Tony Morris, including Stephen Lett, David Splain, Samuel Hurd, Mark Sanderson. These are, after all, the cream of the crop. If you could take from history the 144,000 most wise, most devout Christians of all time, these would be among them. So they're ruling in heaven, and I'm assuming the person sat on the throne in the foreground is Jesus. Is it me, or does that image, I mean, I know I'm a Star Wars fan, and probably people are sick of me talking about Star Wars, but since I have included the Palpatine scene at the beginning of each of my convention rebuttals, it seems fitting to kind of come full circle. Does this not look like the Imperial Senate?
In order to ensure the security and continuing stability, the Republic will be reorganized into the First Galactic Empire!
So it's quite fitting to end on that, really, isn't it? Because it's a similar story. In Star Wars, you have peace being brought about by dictatorship and death, and a device that can kill entire planets. And in the new system, in the paradise, in God's kingdom, you have this rulership that is responsible for the slaughter of billions in the name of bringing about peace. But that's it. We're finally there. We're at the end of the 2022 Pursue Peace Convention. There's been no shortage of things to talk about. As I've already said in my rebuttals, I actually don't think this is the worst convention ever. Don't get me wrong. There have been many moments, particularly in the first few sessions of the convention, that had my blood boiling. But overall, I actually think, if anything, there is plenty of material in this particular convention that will help Jehovah's Witnesses piece things together. There are little breadcrumbs, I think, throughout this convention that sort of show the fantasy unraveling, where you can start to see things not really making sense. And in particular, thanks to some of the dramatizations, you can see how human the organization is and how it's just the same as any other organization when it comes to gossip and infighting and controversy, arguing, unpleasantness. Isn't that what you expect to see in any organization? So how are Jehovah's Witnesses any different, as I've repeatedly argued? I think overall, I'm sort of happy that Jehovah's Witnesses are seeing this convention, because again, maybe it will sow some seeds. Maybe it will be just the final push that some need to see that this is an organization, this is a group of men who are entirely undeserving of respect and adoration. But that's really all I have for you now. It's time to get on with the usual schedule of rebuttals to JW Broadcasting and all that sort of thing. we can take a rest until next year's convention. But until then, please don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.